The FBI recently marked its 100th year, but from fighting gangsters to mobsters to terrorists, what has the record of the agency been? Tim Lynch, director of the Cato Institute's Project on Criminal Justice, offered a rundown of the good and bad of this country's main federal law enforcement agency at a policy forum held July 23, 2008. You can watch the full event at cato.org.
Everyone here knows that J. Edgar Hoover built the modern FBI. If there's one thing that I think scholars seem to agree upon, it's that Hoover raised the bar for federal police agents. After Hoover, law enforcement was not just a job, it could be a career. He said that anybody that wanted to work for him at the FBI, you either had to have a law degree or an accounting degree, and these educational standards were unprecedented for the time. So he wanted to build an elite force, and he was, to some extent, able to accomplish that objective, and that's something that scholars give him credit for. Now, at the same time, I think it must be said that J. Edgar Hoover had a warped vision when it came to the role of a police agency in a free society. He would open up files on people not for legitimate law enforcement investigations, but he would open up files on people simply because he strongly disagreed with their political beliefs and their political activism. After Hoover's death and when his files were opened up, it became clear that he let his FBI become something of a political dirt collection machine for presidents and members of Congress. If you were allied with Hoover and the FBI, he would feed you information on your political rivals. If you were not allied with Hoover and the FBI, then you ran the risk that he would be feeding information to your political opponents, information about yourself, your family, or your associates. It's now well known that Hoover not only wiretapped and bugged Martin Luther King, but he went so far as to take tapes of King's sexual affairs, and he would play these tapes to newspaper editorial writers because he wanted to undermine King's leadership of the civil rights movement. And what is less well known is that when it became public that Martin Luther King was going to receive the Nobel Prize for Peace, this drove Hoover crazy because he thought Martin Luther King was getting these prestigious awards and he didn't deserve them. So the FBI went so far as to pressure King into committing suicide. They were saying, if you don't commit suicide, we're going to blackmail you, we're going to make these embarrassing details public. Now that is so far away from a legitimate law enforcement investigation as to be its very opposite. Now another issue I think that is important to highlight is that Hoover held the FBI out to be the best investigative service in the world, and yet he went so far as to deny the existence of the Mafia, and he did that for years and years until it became so obvious to everyone that the evidence was plain as day that he had to shift his position. And then he lurched completely in the opposite direction. He went so far as to try to crush Mafia big shots by any means at his disposal. We now know that the FBI would let some Mafia henchmen go ahead and commit violent crimes, including murder, so long as they were feeding information about other Mafia families, and they're feeding that information to the Bureau. The FBI also looked the other way while some totally innocent people went to jail for crimes that were committed by these Mafia henchmen. 60 Minutes did a story on this a few years ago, and they showed through documentation that this just wasn't one FBI field office that was running amok. They showed the documentation and the memos that went to FBI headquarters that showed that at headquarters they knew this was going on, and they let it happen. Last year, a federal judge ordered the government to pay $100 million to 4 men who served decades in prison for a 1965 murder that they did not commit. And this lawsuit was brought against the federal government because the FBI withheld evidence of their innocence. The judge said it took 30 years to uncover this injustice, and that the government's defense that the FBI had no duty to come forward to correct this miscarriage of justice was just absurd. But the real turning point, in my view, as far as the FBI image, is probably going to be the loss of life at Waco in 1993. It was the worst disaster in the history of federal law enforcement. More than 75 people died, including 25 children. Now, this didn't start out as an FBI operation. For those of you who need some refreshing on that incident. It initially started out as an investigation by the Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms Agency. They were conducting a firearms investigation, and they conducted a raid on the Branch Davidian compound down in Waco, Texas. And during the course of that raid, there was a firefight and people were killed on both sides. And then a standoff began. And it was shortly after the standoff that the FBI came in to take over the operation. And the FBI special agent in charge who took over at that time, I think they started off with the right idea. He told the public that his goal was to wait as long as it took to end the standoff, to end things without any further bloodshed. And they wanted to resolve this dispute peacefully in federal court, and they were going to wait as long as it took to make that happen. As we all know, after 50 days of frustrating negotiations, the FBI asked for and were given permission by Attorney General Janet Reno to assault the compound on April 19th, 1993. They went in with tanks to assault the Mount Carmel residents with tear gas. If the plan was to save lives, it was an utter disaster because virtually every person in the residence died by the end of the day. President Clinton, Attorney General Reno, and FBI officials have tried to wrap up that whole incident as a mass suicide, but I think that's a distortion of what happened. It doesn't matter that the Branch Davidian leader, David Koresh, was a criminal, and it ultimately is beside the point that the Branch Davidians may have started the fire because there was no reason for the FBI tanks to attack the compound that morning. And the FBI officials have admitted, it's on the record, that when those tanks were smashing into that building, they did not know what was on the other side of that wall. There were women and children in there, and they did not know what was on the other side of that wall. So while some FBI agents did pull some of the Davidians out of the fire that day, we also know that some FBI agents acted recklessly with that conduct with the tanks. And we also know that the FBI obstructed a congressional investigation in 1996 into their operations because there was a civil suit a few years later, and there was a ton of documentation that came out during that litigation that we now know was not revealed to the Congress when they looked into the Waco investigation in hearings in 1996. Now, there have been real FBI achievements, which we are going to hear about. At the top of that list, I'd put the remarkable undercover investigation of Agent Joe Pistone in the late 1970s and early 1980s. He fooled Mafia big shots into thinking that he was one of them, and he was able to collect enough information over a period of years to send 120 Mafia wise guys to prison. So I think that was an incredibly successful investigation. As far as possible reforms go, I think the main problem is that the jurisdiction of the FBI is way too broad. We now have more than 4,000 federal crimes on the books, and the overwhelming bulk of those offenses are based upon a dubious interpretation of the Commerce Clause of our Constitution, and they also duplicate many of the crimes that are already on the books at the state and local level that are handled by state and local police. In recent years, the FBI has been investigating carjacking, marijuana smuggling, prostitution, and with the conviction of that football player a few months ago, Michael Vicks, we now know that the FBI agents have also been conducting investigations into dogfighting. Now, at a time when al-Qaeda terrorists would like nothing better than to come back to the United States to perpetrate an atrocity on the scale of 9/11, this is a gross allocation of limited law enforcement resources. But this is more of a policy question for the Congress, and it's something for congressmen to address. Too often, members of Congress want to expand the mission of the FBI to get them involved in the congressman's pet causes, and this expansion of the FBI's jurisdiction causes them to forget about their main mission and gets them off into these, I think, less important investigations that can be adequately handled by state and local police.
Tim Lynch is director of the Cato Institute's Project on Criminal Justice. The full FBI event is available for download at cato.org.